My name is Will Prince with the Louisiana Trust for Historic Preservation, and today we are continuing our profiles in preservation, highlighting different historic sites and places and how they are approaching preservation and different types of tools and resources being used to make those renovations possible. Today we're going to be talking about the Murray Henderson Elementary School in Algiers, and today we are with James Rolf of Rolf Preservation Works. Hi James, how are you today?
Good. Well, how are you? Thanks for having me.
Doing great. Well, we're excited to learn more about the Murray Henderson Elementary. If you could just tell us a bit more about yourself and how you were connected to this school.
Sure. This is a very circular story. I started my time with schools as part of my practicum for the Tulane Masters of Preservation program. Started with the Recovery School District, which is part of the Louisiana Department of Education. And it is a $2.1 billion FEMA-funded school facilities master plan that we are nearing the end of the execution. The last school that we're working on, which is not Murray Henderson, is the 27th project that I will be working on that is involving preservation and tax credits. So when I first started with RSD, my task was to identify surplus properties that RSD and the school board had that they were looking for a pro forma on the highest and best use in order to either surplus them and put them up for auction or hold on to them and have them for swing spaces or the like. So one of the properties that I looked at was Murray Henderson, and it really was just a number for me. It kind of flew under the radar. It was just this little one-story brick building or series of buildings. And it wound up being a little too small for the school board's current needs. And so the highest and best use was to put it for auction. And so that was in 2016 when I did the report. And in 2017, it was sold by the school board to a private developer. And I didn't hear about it until about 4 years ago, where a developer's representative called me and said, "Hey, we know you do tax credit work. Are you familiar with mid-century schools?" I said, "Yes, I am. I've worked on a couple of them." They didn't tell me the name of the project or the location until a little bit later. And when I discovered I had worked on it and I submitted the proposal, I said, just as a side note, I'm very familiar with this property and the campus, and I think it stands a very good chance of being listed on the National Register because the client wanted to utilize both the federal credit and the state credit, and so we had to expand the cultural district as well as individually list the building on the National Register. So and that scope shifted from my work at RSD to my work with Rolf Preservation Works, which I started in 2018 to work on and preserve any building or site that was not an operating school in the Orleans Parish School Board. And so since 2018, we have grown tremendously. We have a great team, and we are growing rapidly. And this is one of our larger projects right now, the Murray Henderson School in Algiers.
Great. It's a full circle there, as he's mentioned. And so
Yeah.
if you could tell us a little bit about the history of, and maybe a little bit about the architecture about the Murray Henderson School. You mentioned it's mid-century, but what is the kind of context of its neighborhood and its history, and why is it significant?
Sure. So it is, as you mentioned, it is in Algiers, but it is not part of Algiers Point. It is right across the street from the Fisher School, which was built right next to the Fisher housing projects, which are no longer there. The school was built in 1958. The original school building, there are three buildings. There's the original school building, there's the auditorium / cafeteria / administrative building. And then in 1967, they built an addition, but the 1958 buildings were part of the 1952 School Facilities Master Plan, which predates the current master plan, the 2011 master plan. And that 1952 master plan sought to address the lack of facilities for a growing population, specifically a growing Black population. There were, I think, 26 new white schools proposed and 53 new Black schools proposed. And they were, the goal was to build enough schools for Black children to where they could avoid desegregation. And that was ultimately the goal. And it was unfortunate, but it is also the reason why the school on the West Bank, Murray Henderson, which was one of two that still remain of the three that were built for Black children, it's only one of two that remain, which makes it significant in its own right. LB Landry, which is just north, was demolished shortly after Katrina. McDonough 32, which has its actual third iteration, is that other school that remains. It is a swing space right now. Neither McDonough 32 nor Murray Henderson are super architecturally significant. It's a very minimalist, international style, just low profile brick, ribbons of windows, where the windows still remain. And so we were really relying heavily on the cultural significance criterion A for regional significance in Black education to list it on the National Register. So with the idea of looking to reuse schools, which is pretty common, and there's been different uses, housing and community centers, things like that. But what were some of the first steps that were taken to, make the effort to start renovation and start reuse? What were some of the first steps, maybe some of those tools that were used to kind of start the process? Sure. The client first engaged an architecture firm that is very familiar with historic properties, and specifically larger historic properties that are a good target for adaptive reuse. And so the first step before I became involved was to get some renderings and get some preliminary floor plans drawn to see if in fact the building or buildings were feasible for the end use, and that end use being affordable housing. This project, and I'll tell you that my client actually doesn't even own the property yet. And the impetus and the trigger for purchasing the property was knowing that we could in fact use historic tax credits on it. And so that's where I got involved. The architect actually reached out to me and asked me, okay, how can we get tax credits for this property? And so I said, well, I think you have a good argument for an individual listing, and we need to extend the cultural district. And so once they had my verbal, yes, this is feasible, we started doing Zoom meetings. This was during COVID, right? We started doing Zoom meetings, working through the plans and getting all the square footage requirements right that would meet affordable housing requirements and also leave the character defining features in place. And that immediately started working with the SHPO on saying, hey, what are you looking for in these spaces? What do we need to try to avoid or try to achieve when we're programming this space? And so that has been the driving force. And I'll actually tell you that as of now, SHPO has recommended an approval for the preliminary determination of individual listing for the National Register, and the Cultural District has been expanded. So we are well on our way.
Congratulations! Those are big steps to make it, to get things going. So as you're working with the tax credits and things like that, have there been any challenges or really successes that came about that, or any other tools that you kind of used on to really pull it all together? I know you mentioned historic tax credits, but especially looking at housing, what are some other tools that were utilized and have made the difference in this project?
So there were definitely challenges with the tax credits. That was not a shoe-in. One of the biggest challenges for the individual listing was there were a series of fires in these buildings, specifically the 1958 school building. In 1980, there was a very large fire that destroyed about half of the structure, half of the interior of the structure. As a result of that, and probably driven by some crime statistics in the 80s, the school board elected to replace the window openings with brick infill. And the argument was, well, you can still see where the windows were, and they're easy to produce. But it was, even though we were relying on the history of the building and integration and that narrative, the Park Service was still giving us grief about the loss of these windows. So we really had to try to mitigate that. And I think we have a very, very strong team member who's well versed in mitigation when it comes to preliminary determinations, and we relied heavily on her expertise. And so again, we have that recommendation. The challenge for the cultural district, which I thought would be the easiest, was there were certain members of the community who did not fully understand what a cultural district was, and they felt like it was going to be an additional layer of regulation. And no matter how many ways we tried delivering that message, we still experienced some roadblocks. So we wound up broadening our scope and working with other members of the community and involving the city council, and finally got that approved, the cultural district approved. So there are 3, possibly 4 parts of the capital stack that the developer wants to use for this project: federal historic, state historic, and LIHTC, low-income housing tax credits. And that's what you were alluding to earlier when you were asking about what are the other tools that we can use. The low-income housing tax credits, this program has either a 4% or a 9% tax credit. The 4% is not as competitive. The 9% is very competitive. So our client has elected to go with the 4% credit, and there is a 15-year compliance period. Whereas the federal credit is a 5-year compliance period. There's a 15-year compliance period for LIHTC, and the requirement is that you would have 20, usually 40%, oftentimes 90 to 100% of the units are considered affordable housing units. Considering that the client wanted to do affordable housing and that worked with their model, and they've done this on other projects before, this was not an issue for them. This is going to be likely 90 to 100% affordable housing with some heavy community space requirements involved, with some learning and some after school classes and things like that. The 4th potential part of this capital stack would be CDBG funds, community development block grants. And that's still possibly on the table. The developer might actually use those funds for another project, but we'll see. All in all, with these tax credits, you're paying for almost half of the development cost, which is very much needed on a project like this, where you have a lot of challenges and a lot of additional costs with construction.
Great. It's it takes a lot of calculating to put those together and really make the project work. As you move forward, what have been some thoughts, especially with adaptive reuse of schools to living quarters? What have been some considerations, or what stands out to make that possible with this renovation, or with schools in general?
With schools in general, specifically the 1952 master plan, the New Orleans School Facilities Master Plan, which they called the Long Range School Building Program, with the 52 master plan, there was a heavy emphasis on natural light. One of the major issues with the older schools pre-1950 was the lack of light and the inability for students to see what the teacher was writing on the chalkboard. And so, especially with the international style on this building and the ribbon of windows, which there is still basically it's a clear story at this point with the loss of the windows below. Maintaining that natural light has been essential in the planning. And this is something that the client wanted to do anyway. Natural light sells. People want more natural light, right, for living. So that was one focus, one challenge. Another is, as I mentioned earlier, we talked about community spaces. So when you take a school or a church or another institutional building like that, you're going to have these large gathering spaces like an auditorium or a cafeteria. And whenever you decide to redevelop that, you need to be mindful of the historic use of those spaces. So you can't just chop it up into pieces and cram it full of individual living units. So instead, for this project, the developer has chosen to use that continue to use that as a community gathering space. And this is where they will offer after school classes and continue in education, maybe even yoga and first time buyers. And there's going to possibly be a computer lab. So they're working with the space as opposed to against it. Finally, I would say the biggest challenge, which really comes down to numbers, is taking these smaller classrooms and combining them into something that is livable and meets that minimum square footage requirement. And the client is not interested in barely meeting requirements. They want to have affordable units that are also enjoyable living units. And so they're going above and beyond with that square footage requirement. But we are joining two classrooms together, which is not uncommon, not only in a redevelopment and adaptive reuse, but actually with the current school facilities master plan, we're to meet education specifications of today, we're joining classrooms together and still using tax credits. And the key to that is to not cut through a window or a door of any other character defining features. So that's when it's important for you to have a really good team, like an architect who's familiar with this type of work.
Well, these are all great tips, especially, there's lots of old schools that can find new uses, and these hopefully those listening will get some ideas to, how to adapt their local schools that can be an asset or anchor to their community again. Thank you for joining us today. Is there any other closing thoughts or comments you'd like to share with us before we go?
This is a great video series that the Louisiana Trust is doing. So thank you, Will. I appreciate you asking me to be a part of this and Rolf Preservation Works. And again, we're a growing team. And so thank you for highlighting throughout the state these smaller shops that are trying to contribute to the historic fabric of Louisiana.